PRAJNA SPARKS, a podcast where we listen to a Dharma teaching, contemplate through conversation and song, and engage in guided meditation. Today, Lama Yeshe talks about the challenges and benefits of being cloistered, and you learn what a 3-year retreat is like.
So in Tibetan, the word tsam is usually translated in English as retreat. Literally what it means is a border or a boundary, even a dividing line. It's the same exact word you use in everyday colloquial Tibetan as like a boundary between states or nations. And this issue is a really interesting one because it's actually really an important pointing out in Buddhist practice, because tsam, that border, is basically pointing to creating our own space for practice. Another Tibetan word, nangpa, which is the word for Buddhist, means inwarder. So the space we're creating is an inward space, an inward sacred space in which we do our practice. Like a lot of terms, there's a more dimension to this than the Tibetan word, the English translation, retreat, points out. So first of all, what Sam is talking about is something that we do all the time, even if we're just doing our regular daily practice for, say, 30 minutes in the morning and in the evening. There's a tsam, a boundary that we create when we sit. Some of that is held by small rituals like lighting candles or incense or filling water bowls. It creates a sacred space around us physically that we can then take inward to engender a foundation for the kind of environment we want to develop inwardly for our practice. So then what kind of boundary is it that we're talking about? Again, with Tibetan Buddhism, there's a really strong emphasis placed on empowering body, speech, and mind to act in unity. So the boundary, the border or dividing line, is one that works in this threefold fashion. The first and most obvious is a physical boundary. Maybe in our regular everyday practice, we have a special corner in our room. Perhaps we close the door, or maybe we've even set up a small room in our home that's for meditation, or maybe we're setting up for a retreat in a group center where we actually go someplace with physical boundaries that's set apart from the rest of the world. That is the physical seclusion that we're developing with this first boundary. We're separating ourselves from the usual distractions and busyness that come up in our life to foster that environment. Next comes a seclusion of speech. A lot of times in group retreat, we see that we even engage in silent practice. There's practices where the group in general is not speaking to one another either throughout the retreat or through at specific times. In our daily practice, we don't engage in conversation on the phone or whatever it may be for the 30 minutes of our practice. That's the verbal boundary that we're adding to the physical dimension. The point of these two is the third seclusion, the boundary around mind. What we're doing with the physical and verbal seclusion is creating that inward space. That tsam is actually defining an inward sacredness, what I like to call cloister. That's my preferred translation for the Tibetan tsam. It's a cloister, which has more connotations in Western culture for the kinds of things that we're doing in Buddhist practice with body, speech, and mind to really develop strong foundations, really a cultivating place for our practice to flourish, for us to not fall into distractions of body and speech, which then naturally lead to distractions of mind. So we've already talked about individual daily retreat. We might even do individual retreat at home. We might do a group retreat. But if we think about it as a cloister, we'll have more of a sense of intentionality, I think about it. Retreat sounds like we're running away from something, and that's not quite the point of what this style of Dharma practice is about. It's actually about charging at our experience within the space of this cloister. So while there are many different ways that we can incorporate it in our daily life, in my lineage, the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, probably the most iconic form of cloister is what is called the 3-year meditation cloister. It's a very intensive style of practice, which is one of several things that is required in most instances, but not all, for a practitioner to be recognized as a Lama. So what is this 3-year meditation cloister? First of all, as we will find when we look at the way Tibetans count things, the 3 years is not actually 3 years. It is 3 years and 3 phases of the moon. Phases means 3 new to full moons. So it's actually 3 years and 3 fortnights. This particular timing is tied to shifts in the subtle body energies that are present within us all. There is a sense that in that amount of time, there is a full cycle for a shift in subtle body energies, which is why that particular amount was used as the anchor. And this particular tradition, there are very many different traditions of cloister, but this particular one in my lineage was something that was set in place by Jamgon Kongtrul Lodru Tai in Tibet in about the 19th century. Jamgon Rinpoche, this was the first Jamgon Rinpoche, was a great master of meditation in Eastern Tibet. It is his monastery in present-day Nepal, which is Pulhari Monastery, where Zopa and I have studied, practiced, and taught and translated for going on 20 years now. So the reason that's important is that lineage is really critical when we're talking about these kinds of cloister. Not all Tibetan Buddhist lineages have this tradition of 3-year cloister as a way to develop a practitioner into meditation practices or as a Lama. But this is one of the ways that it occurs. Whatever way it happens, it's necessarily going to be in the context of a lineage. I find that with 3-year meditation cloister, it's best for me to talk less and leave more questions because there's always a lot of questions and I'm always surprised and enchanted by the questions that I hear. So let's go with the ones that I hear most often. First of all is it really 3 years? The answer to that is no, it's actually 3 years and 3 fortnights. So about 6 weeks over 3 years because it's a lunar calendar. The next question is, are you really going to be celibate for this entire period of time? Yes, that is the second most prominent question. And yes, for most 3-year meditation cloisters in my lineage and others that I know of, these are celibate retreats. People take either full monastic or novice monastic vows. There may be variation in other lineages. The next most prominent question is it really cloistered? Yes, it is really cloistered, but also not necessarily. Traditionally, it is very strictly cloistered. The beginning of the cloister period is when the boundaries are actually erected. There are actual physical wooden posts placed in various directions to indicate that there is a cloister going on, to preserve that boundary. There again, we're physically defining a boundary within which this practice is being fostered, nourished, even nurtured. In present-day Western countries, there are a lot of people who want to do this kind of practice, but can't necessarily be cloistered for that period of time. And we'll get to that in a minute, what happens in those situations. But then the next most common thing, and probably the part that I can talk most about, is what are you doing in there? Completely locked away from the world for 3 years and 3 fortnights. So what we're doing is a very intensive schedule of meditation. We start, the formal schedule starts at about 4 or 4:30 in the morning and ends about 9 in the evening at the beginning of the 3 fortnight period. It does get longer, beginning 6 months in or so. And again, all of these statements I'm making are with respect to my particular lineage and the retreat center where I did the 3-year meditation cloister, Vajravidya Retreat Center in Crestone, Colorado, which is under Trungpa Rinpoche. So basically, during that period from 4:30 in the morning till 9 or later at night, there are several individual as well as group meditation periods. The practices that we're doing vary. One of the things that is really intensive about the 3-year meditation cloister is the purpose of this is to really become exposed to the seminal practices of the particular lineage. This is the express purpose of the 3-year meditation cloister. So what happens is that there is basically a curriculum that starts out with practices that are protections of that boundary, of that cloister for the first week, and then go through what are called the nundro or prerequisite practices. These are practices that people do outside of retreat as well. It's fairly common in all of the lineages of Tibetan Buddhism with some variations as to the details. In a 3-year retreat, we do it again. Now, I say again because most retreat centers up until now have required people entering cloister to have completed a full nundro, which is 111,111 repetitions of 4 different practices, refuge and bodhicitta being the first, Vajrasattva the second, mandala, and guru yoga. So that's in, again, the Kagyu lineage. Those are repeated. And then after that, there are various practices of meditational deities, guru yoga, subtle body practices, protector practices, lots of generosity practice. Generosity through visualizations to spirits, to other beings, really giving up any sense of ownership in the capitalist sense of things, to even our own bodies. So that's the very succinct explanation of what those practices are. It would take about 3 years and 3 fortnights to explain those practices properly. But the point of it is that we are being exposed to these practices so we have a basic level of fluency in these practices. What's typical in the 3-year meditation cloister is just astonishment at the speed with which things go. You'd think that in the course of 3 years, things would get boring or slow, but there really isn't time for that. Everything goes very quickly. Most practices, you spend a month to 6 weeks, up to 6 months on one practice. Even within the practice, there'll be different layers to the practice that change over time. There's lots of elaborate rituals and chanting and several practices going on in any given day. So it's very full, very intense. And as soon as you get the hang of one practice, they take it away from you and give you a new one. So as you can see, it can be very challenging emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. And then, of course, there isn't contact with friends and family formally. You don't have internet or telephone. There's no news. There's no podcasts. There's no telephones. In our retreat, we communicated. Zopa and I did the retreat together, which is also unusual. And we were able to communicate by correspondence with our friends and family once a month. We exchanged letters, and that's pretty common. But again, there may be variations. Also, typically, retreats used to be separated by gender. There'd be a female wing and a male wing. This is typical in the West. In Tibet, it wasn't very typical for women to do 3-year meditation cloister at all. And when they did, they were only women involved, and men's retreats were only men. More recently in the West, there have been co-ed retreats, but typically separated in different wings. Increasingly, because the costs of the physical plant is very high. There are more and more co-ed retreats, and our retreat was one of them. But before we go on to the discussion and the questions, what I wanted to say is, why would anybody do this? Why would you lock yourself up, very often with total strangers? Not everybody gets to lock themselves up with their spouse for a 3-year meditation cloister. And then put yourself under this really grueling schedule. I mean, easily the biggest task in the first few months of the cloister is just being able to manage without a lot of sleep, because there isn't a lot of sleep. That the sleep that does occur traditionally occurs in what's called a gomtri, a meditation throne, literally. It's usually called a box because it's a square, a very large square chair, basically, with cushioning inside, and all of your practice and sleeping occurs seated in this meditation box. So not a lot of sleep, not lying down in a bed takes a lot of getting used to. So that's a couple of months of getting used to that. The reason for that is it makes the consciousness a little bit lighter, a little bit more ready for work first thing in the morning instead of groggy and tired. But of course, it does take time before that happens. When you wake up, you're in your space. Very, very much a boundary in this square box where you're creating the sacred space, and all of your individual practice occurs in this box for all of the time. There's also sleep yoga practice. So that's also happening for a period of time during the 3 years in this box. And then group practices, of course, occur in a temple setting. Why would you do this? First of all, there's lots of, I can't say all the reasons why individual people would do it, but looking back at my experience, why would I do this knowing what I know now? I would do it if I have a very strong connection to the lineage and I really want to hold the practices of the lineage. There's one thing I've learned about what this whole cloister is about. It's about creating living, breathing containers of these practices. These practices are alive. They're not something that exists on a two-dimensional page. They exist within the consciousness, within the breath of living beings. And that's the main reason that I can consider for doing this cloister. It's also something that is often an outgrowth of our practice, whether it be the Nundro practices. Some people have done a lot of the tantric practices. I was not one of those people. I'd done mostly Nundro and basic Yidam, meditational deity practices, before 3-year retreat. It's also in our lineage a Mahamudra retreat. So you might do it because you have a particular interest in very intensive training in Mahamudra, which is a particular style of meditation peculiar to the Kagyu lineage. And then each lineage would have their own counterpart for that. You also do it because you have a strong drive to really connect with a consistent sense of presence, of awareness within our own consciousness, to really allow the mind to settle enough to get instructions which are extremely difficult to get outside of the setting of 3-year meditation cloister. Most of these practices are very elaborate, and it's not easy to get instruction on these outside of these settings. Also, you have to be really interested in the workings of your mind. My root guru, Kyabje Boka Rinpoche, advised us to do a lot of shorter individual meditation cloister for a month, even a week, a couple of months. And we did that for several years leading into 3-year cloister. The reason for that is what I like to call your own particular crazy, which comes out whenever you turn the mind inward. What we're doing is we're creating layers of boundary, physical, verbal, and mental, so we can turn inward and really practice with our mind, really get intimate with mind throughout all of these different practices. And that can bring up a lot of real difficulties. As a matter of fact, it often does. So one of the other things that's wonderful about Cloister, and would be good to want to do before going in, is that it really gets you very familiar with your kleshas. those emotions that disturb our mind's natural tranquility. It also really holds up a mirror to how frequently you finger point and blame others or conditions or the world for all of the things that are really among the few things that we have any control over, our own emotions. Of course, it's basically a pressure cooker situation that's created with all of these boundaries and everybody going through these difficulties at once. So it's advisable to have gone through the Ninjo practices completely, in my view, prior to starting 3-year meditation cloister. Without that, it's very easy to get lost in the constant stream and change of very different complicated practices. It's also good to have had counseling or therapy or some kind of training in understanding your own emotions and having resilience around your own emotional states. If you spend all of your time in the cloister seething about other people's behavior, you're not going to have a very good time, and not many good results come out of that. It's almost built into the cloister silently that, and many people have said this, that learning to get along with others or to accept that you're not going to is part and parcel of the 3-year meditation cloister. So what it's doing is giving us flexibility on a mental and spiritual level that we need and want and work on every day. One of my favorite little quips about 3-year meditation cloister is that I had to go there to realize I didn't really have to go there because there's material to work on some of these aspects in everyday life. When it comes to really becoming more flexible, more pliable, less blaming, more inward turned, more familiar with our own particular crazy, our own dominant kleshas, and how we can work with those in ways that are gentle and precise and humorous, as Pema Chodron advises, both towards ourselves and towards others. These are things we can do all the time. Other things not so easy. The individual yidam or meditational practices are very complicated, hard to get the empowerments, hard to get the instructions, hard to have a setup where there are people cooking for you and shopping for groceries and doing everything possible so that all your time can be devoted to this. That's the critical reason to do the cloister. There are some folks who either have physical limitations or emotionally and psychologically are not fit for that kind of setup, or just logistically, they have family or work or other things that have demands on their time. And there are increasingly centers in the West that are making adjustments so that there are ways that people can learn these practices in different settings. So that's a possibility for those who hear all this and say, oh, that's way too much, but I'm still intrigued. How can I find out more? So that gives a bit of a sense of what that cloister is about. The final thing I would say is that for me, what I learned through 3-year meditation cloister is the importance of a surrendering of our own ideas, opinions, views, our cognitive sense of how everything should be. As folks who are basically experts in samsara, as most of us with fancy telephones listening to podcasts are, we've managed to really come to a place where a lot of the basics are within our control. This is not true for most of the people in the world. But when we have that kind of privilege, when we have that kind of freedom built on the lack of freedom of others, we forget that not everything is in our control. Not everything is actually something that we can just push a button and allow to happen. And that ability to surrender in service to something larger, whether it be the teacher you're working with, the group that you're with, our own Buddha nature, and the aspiration that all beings attain that Buddha nature, that surrender is absolutely invaluable.
For sharing sharing all of that. I really appreciate you talking about your experience of the 3-year retreat. So while you were on retreat, I was out there in the world trying to explain to people why I couldn't talk to one of my best friends for 3 years. And so what I would always say is it's a lot like when you were in law school. You were busy, so we didn't communicate much, and you were preparing yourself for what you would be doing afterward. And it felt like this analogy was helpful because Westerners aren't as familiar with the idea of a lengthy spiritual retreat. It sounds like you also had to explain it to a lot of people.
Yes, that's right. People are definitely very curious about it. It's an odd fish.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you had that opportunity to do it. And I'm also glad that I can talk to you again.
Me too.
So, the song from the first episode was an adaptation of a piece from The Sound of Music, which is a story about a nun who has trouble sticking to the rules and leaves the cloistered life. But then when she starts to grapple with desire in the outside world, she seeks refuge back at the nunnery. And then Mother Superior tells her to climb every mountain and, blah, 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 all the rest of the movie. But I feel like the implication is that there are some people who adapt well to cloistered experience, like Mother Superior and the other nuns, and others who are better suited for life outside, like Maria. And you talked about some reasons a 3-year retreat might not be a good fit for some people. But I'm wondering if that's also true of shorter cloistered experiences, like a daily meditation practice. Will that be easier for some people than others? And should people who struggle take that as a sign that they're not well suited to it, or should they just keep trying?
That's a wonderful question. There's definitely circumstances in the 3-year meditation cloister that are very intense. At the same time, from the flip side of that, they're extremely supportive. So I know of another story about a nun. This was a Catholic nun who actually left the convent because she felt it was too easy. Everything was taken care of for her. All of the things that might trigger all kinds of difficult emotions were cleared away, and she didn't get down into the nitty gritty and messiness of being a human in the world just now. So there's two ways of looking at it. I think actually anybody can do any of these if they're well prepared for it. But the preparation for 3-year meditation cloister is a lot more intensive than for a daily meditation practice. What you need for a daily meditation practice, that style of cloister, is a mind. If you have a mind, you've got it. You've checked off the list of prerequisites for a daily meditation practice. So if it's difficult, it's actually an indication that you're paying attention, that you're noticing what maybe just went under the radar in the past. It's not uncommon when we first start a daily meditation practice to feel like your thoughts are going bonkers and you're absolutely insane and all kinds of ideas. That's an indicator that you're already starting to do the good work that meditation opens up for us. It's not an indication that you're not suited for a daily practice. But we will all have different things that we tackle in any cloister, from just a general daily meditation practice at home to maybe a weekend group retreat or a week or a month or longer. And again, the key piece is the preparation. For a daily practice, you don't need a lot of preparation, but some support for any of these is helpful from teachers or a sangha, which is a Buddhist term, which means the community, the group of practitioners.
Yeah, it sounds like you had some good guidance from teachers in terms of that preparation. And I'm wondering if you have some guidance for people who don't have a teacher, like how should they determine what's the best sort of level of practice for them? Like when are they ready to do a weekend retreat or a week-long retreat or something longer than that? So if you've got any thoughts on that, that would be great.
That's a really good question too. It's very individual. So with Buddhist practice in particular, the role of an instructor or a teacher in Tibetan Buddhist practice might be a lama. is very helpful. There, you can really talk to people who get to know you and get to see you in the context of a center and have a sense of whether this will be helpful for you or not. But ultimately, we have to be our own best Lama because we see our own minds. So working on our own in our daily practice and maybe setting up our own boundaries, our own our own cloister for the day. Say it's a Saturday or a Sunday when we don't have to work and we can make arrangements to keep the phone off and nobody comes over. Really see how much we're able to do it. When you are faced with no escape hatch, all of the little boogeymen start coming out of the corners of our mind. And that's where we'll really start to get a sense of what I talked about earlier, our own personal crazy, and whether it's actually helpful to go into a weekend or a longer retreat setting in a group, or maybe we just need a little more training, a little more preparation on our own before we can do that. If we set out and we make an intention for a day, and before the first hour's up, we're already chomping at the bit, maybe we've taken on a little more than we can chew. And one of the ways that I hope we'll talk about as this podcast progresses is how we can break up the day and even a meditation session into bite-sized pieces that are a little bit easier to get through. And to me, that's really the best way to know for ourselves how much we're able to do it. Just like you wouldn't jump onto Carnegie Hall to play the concert piano after your first week of instruction, you wouldn't necessarily jump into a very intense cloister situation in meditation. That said, I have heard of many people who are new to Buddhism and hear about a 3-year meditation cloister that's about to open and become a part of it and do extremely well. So again, variation is all over the place, and we are our own best indicator of what we're able to do.
Your mileage may vary.
Your mileage may vary.
I know that you and Lama Zopa do offer individual consultations. And so is that something, if people were trying to figure that out, is that the kind of thing that people might come and ask you about?
Certainly. I mean, it's a lot easier for a teacher to help out with that kind of thing if you have an ongoing connection and they know more about you. But even someone that we've never heard of before or met before, we can get a sense of what their background is, what their preparation is, and how ready they may be for a weekend or a week or longer meditation cloister.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I would love to talk about how all of this relates to the current circumstances with COVID-19 going on. The global pandemic has created sort of a forced boundary for many people, not for everyone, because there are essential workers, and then there are people who have more going on in their homes because they're parenting or taking care of other people. But for some of us, life has quieted down and created more space for inward reflection. You were describing Nundro, and I've been doing this collection of practices for almost 18 years, and I am not even halfway through the first of the 4 practices. But given all of that, a third of what I've completed, I've done since the quarantine started 4 months ago. And so I'm really curious to hear you talk about this idea of boundary or cloister in the context of our current situation.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is that what the situation is showing us is something that I hear a lot of people speak of within the 3-year meditation cloister, which is that boundary becomes a signal of freedom. I really experienced that cloister, those boundaries, and not just physical boundaries, but there's a lot of rules in the 3-year meditation cloister. There's specific times you have to get up. There's specific times you have to go to sleep. There are only specific times to eat, and it will vary. But those boundaries, those parameters are actually freeing because we spend an immense amount of time pondering choices. And we have a lot of choices. I call this the tyranny of too many options. We spend a lot of time just embattled by this tyranny of how many options we have, and this idea that the choice we make will make a monumental difference in our lives. And sometimes that's true. But what the quarantine is really helping us see is just how full and rich our lives can be, without much physical um, change, without a lot of change as to where we are or how far we've gone. And sometimes that fullness and richness may feel intense. But as you say, we're hearing a lot from people where the ability to be home is actually bringing them a sense of tranquility and that sense of freedom of, wow, I can really do this. Whereas sometimes it's hard for us to say no to people who ask for our attention or our time or our care. The situation with the pandemic is really sort of giving us the freedom to really care for ourselves inwardly in a way that can be really empowering and very enriching.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, this is certainly something where people's experiences are so varied in this, but for those of us who do have that opportunity, I think then that's, I don't know if you have any additional guidance in terms of ways that people, I think it's important that people don't put pressure on themselves to accomplish something extraordinary when we're going through this stressful experience in the world. But I also think if you have any guidance for how people can use this time most productively in terms of spiritual practice, that would be really welcome.
I think people should do something extraordinary. This is the time for the extraordinary. If you sit down and watch your breath without stopping, without distraction for 5 minutes, that is extraordinary. We have been completely distracted since time without beginning. To be able to really stay present with ourselves, with our experience, with the breath of life that is flowing through us constantly for even 5 minutes a day is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary thing to do once. It's more extraordinary the next day and the next and the next. So what we're doing is really seeing this process work, how we build care for ourselves into our days, and how that becomes the foundation for genuine care of others. This is extraordinary. If all of us were doing this, what a very different time it would be right now.
I appreciate so much that instruction about breath, and I feel like there are so many things that have brought our attention to breath and to not taking breathing for granted. The situation with George Floyd, the situation with COVID-19 and people on ventilators, and just what you're talking about with paying attention to our breath. And so there's really something in all of this that brings our attention to something that we do every day and that we're not paying attention to, and the richness in that. So thank you.
You're welcome. The breath is a wonderful thing, and it's it's a lifeline. When we, as you say, these poignant stories in our society just now, where people literally can't breathe,
Mm-hmm.
are showing us how much we may take for granted when we can breathe. In many ways, it's a miracle that we manage to get from one breath to the next for any number of reasons. And to really stay alive to the magnificence of that, and to stay alive to our common vulnerability that we don't know when somebody's going to stop our breath or when it will stop on its own. Mm-hmm. That's a really powerful thing. That vulnerability can really open us up to the strength of commonality.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Those are all my questions for today. Is there anything else you want to share?
Yes, one more thing, which I think is also relevant to this question of quarantine and cloister. One thing that I would say is different is that when we're in a meditation cloister, be it for a half an hour or a weekend or 3 years by ourselves or in groups, it's an intentional thing, and it is filled with purpose. It is not just staying in a room closed up for a period of time. There's a lot of purpose to it, there's structure to it, there's support that's built into it. So we can get a sense from the quarantine how things can be restricting, but we can also see how Cloister is more than just closing ourselves up. It's also building ourselves up from the inside out. And that's the critical thing about the meditation cloister that I think I would like to stress. Just living in a retreat center for 3 years does not mean you've managed to get through 3-year retreat. I always joke that we had a lot of mice at our retreat center. If that's all it took, then there'd be a lot of little llama mice running about. But it's that intentionality, it's that surrender, it's that purposefulness, and it's really opening up to our vulnerability in a way that welcomes whatever comes, which is the whole purpose of that, of those boundaries and the support that is built into it.
Thank you. This has been Lama Yeshe and Tania Israel. Next, you'll hear Heather Stevenson with a song, and then Lama Zopa offering a guided meditation. Shivni Ratna is our Tibetan singing bowl artist. Thanks for listening. May all beings benefit.
Cloistered, look into myself and I'm gaining insight. I'm cloistered, boundary around and I'm feeling alright. I have never been the type to filter out distraction, which has made it difficult for Dharma to get traction. Now I try to sit within the boundary of a room. My cell phone rings and my plans are doomed. Sitting in the stillness, but I gotta use the restroom. Then I look at Twitter and it's hard to resume. Confined, my actions can't align just fine. I'm reflecting, perfecting my body, speech, and mind. Ooh, I focus better when I'm able to seclude. I'm trying silence, it's a method tried and true. Cultivating inward sacredness and fuel. Then with intention I take the vow of cloistered. Look into myself and I'm gaining insight. I'm cloistered, boundary around and I'm feeling alright. 1 year later I'm doing Nandro nightly. How my view gets clearer as I'm near to thinking rightly. Busy day and night with this practicing intensive.
I'm just saying this curriculum is comprehensive.
2 years later, in a box I'm sleeping. You would be surprised to see the benefits I'm reaping. The glaciers inside make me whine and pine, but I try to purify, and there's so much that my mind can do. And here I'm cultivating consciousness anew. My awareness ever present shines through. I realize that this sounds kind of woo-woo, but I turn inward and I feel so glad I'm cloistered. Look into myself and I'm gaining insight. I'm cloistered, boundary around and I'm feeling alright. Cloistered, look into myself and I'm gaining insight. I'm cloistered, boundary around and I'm feeling alright. I'm cloistered. I look into myself and I'm gaining insight. I'm cloistered, boundary around and I'm feeling alright. In retreat you can focus your mind. In retreat you can focus your mind. In retreat you can focus your mind. Cloistered.
To begin our meditation, let's just take a couple of moments to arrive in our bodies, in our breath, to really be present with whatever is going on without judgment, without pushing away or chasing after. Just take a moment to breathe in and notice that you are breathing in. Notice whatever sensations, whatever feelings, whatever emotions you have that might be present. And just come into this space of allowance, of being here with ourselves. At the beginning of our meditation, it's so helpful to focus on intentionality, to really be intentional in our practice, in this undertaking that we're pursuing of getting to know ourselves, of making friends with our own minds. And this helps to hone our focus. It also helps us to really enjoy our meditation, which is such a strong aid to our continual practice. So at the start, just allow yourself to feel how amazing it is just to have this time, these 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long you have for this meditation, just to remove yourself from distraction, from the busyness that makes up so much of our days and nights, so much of our lives, and getting the time to spend undistracted, unimpeded from being with ourselves, and generate that sense of curiosity about yourself. This is an extraordinary undertaking that we're going about, getting to know ourselves. We're getting familiar with our own minds, with our own kleshas, our own particular form of crazy, and our own particular form of brilliance. Furthermore, we're also placing ourselves in this lineage that extends back for millennia all the way back to the Buddhas, this noble lineage of ennobling our minds, of seizing this precious opportunity that we have. For the meditation today, there'll be 2 parts. We'll do a little bit of grounding, just focusing on the breath, the shamatha or calm abiding meditation. And then we'll do a little bit of experimenting with the analytical meditation that we've heard about. So for this first aspect, the breath meditation, the shamatha, we're just focusing one-pointedly on our breath. Whatever distractions might come up, whatever thoughts, whatever feelings, we don't have to push them away, but we also don't follow after them. We don't let our attention get swallowed up in them. We just keep bringing our attention back to rest it lightly on the sensation of breathing in and breathing out. And again, if we can have this sense of wonder, it can be such a great aid to our practice. So just how amazing it is that we breathe in after we've let the breath flow out. This isn't always going to be the case. There will come a time when we can't breathe in again. So take the moment just to recognize what a great gift this is that we so often don't pay attention to. So we'll spend just a few seconds right now in this recording focusing on the breath. But I encourage you, if you have a longer session that you're able to do, to pause the recording here and do 3 cycles of 7 breaths in and out, or 3 cycles of 14 breaths in and out, or 3 cycles of 21 breaths in and out, just to really allow yourself to settle into the space, allow your attention to hone in to that sweet spot where it's both resting but fully alert, not distracted. For the second portion of our meditation, we're going to go into this process of analytical meditation. And I thought we'd use a little bit of what we've just been hearing about in terms of retreat and cloister, and investigate our own relationship to that idea of retreat. Perhaps it's something that feels incredibly appealing, whether we're thinking about doing a weekend retreat or the traditional 3-year, 3-fortnight retreat, whatever it might be, whatever retreat or cloister means to you. Again, this investigation is completely personal. There's nothing off limits, but again, you want to keep it in the bounds of what you've determined as the topic of your investigation. So whether cloister sounds great to you, or it sounds horrible, or it's boring to think about, whatever it might be, there's incredible information about you and your mind there. So what we're going to do is we're just going to spend a little bit of time analyzing, investigating ourselves. How do I feel about retreat? Is this something that I would like to do? Is this something that sounds ridiculous? Pay really close attention. Investigate why or why not. The answer to any of those questions might be the way they are. As you investigate, you'll often feel some feeling tone that comes along with it. Pay attention to that. See what that's telling you. Be curious about this. Remember, you're getting to know your own mind. There's no investigation that's off limits. So again, I encourage you to pause this recording here and take however much time feels right, 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, just to really investigate. See what it means to you. And when you get to a point where it feels very powerfully like, oh, I would just love to have a weekend to spend doing 4 sessions a day, and in between the sessions to just contemplating the Dharma. How blissful does that sound? If that's the feeling that you get, then take that as the object of resting meditation. Stop thinking, but focus one-pointedly on that feeling for however long it lasts freshly. And then when it fades away, return back to the analysis, to again investigating for yourself. Of course, this isn't the only answer. You may find, oh no, that sounds horrible. That's also welcome. Allow that to be there. But look, investigate. Why? Why does that sound so horrible? What am I afraid of? What don't I like? What is this pointing to? Because obviously you have some draw to meditation if you've listened to me this far. So allow that investigation. And again, whenever you find something that feels very strong emotionally, that feels like a real gut level reaction, take the opportunity to pause, to stop analyzing, to stop investigating, to stop thinking, and just to rest one-pointedly, be with that sensation. Allow it to change and move however it might, without trying to influence it or manipulate it or feel like you should feel that way or should feel something different. Just be with it in the same way that you were with your breath in the shamatha meditation. And of course, as always, at the end of your practice, engender that nobility of mind that thinks, may whatever slight amount of goodness that comes out of this for myself, may all beings have it. I give it freely to everyone, so that they may find that true inner peace that is our very birthright. Thank you for the practice that you do.